Everyone. Paul Savas, Clackamas County Commissioner, co-chair of C4 Metro, and I'm going to turn it over to my other co-chair, Councilor Sherman.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you on this beautiful sunny morning. Going to be the start of some great weather here in town. So the meeting is canceled. Have a good day. It is not. We're exactly Trent's like, okay. Appreciate having everyone here this morning. We've got a nice full agenda, and we're going to focus a lot on transportation, which I appreciate. So kicking us off today, we are going to do an RFFA update. So who has got that one this morning?
Pleased to introduce Grace Cho and Debbie
I apologize.
Cho.
Okay.
Hey, if it's okay for us to begin, we don't have a slideshow today for you, but we'll just walk through our presentation and discussion. And we did submit some materials for the C4 packet, and so I'll be making a couple of references as it relates to that. I wanted to thank the chair and vice chair again. My name is Grace Cho. I'm a senior transportation planner at Metro, and I'm leading the 2028 through 2030 Regional Flexible Fund allocation process. Really appreciate the opportunity to come this morning and actually walk you through the options as well as the discussion being brought forward at the regional table at this time. So, to begin, helps to always start from the top very briefly. So what we're talking about here is the Regional Flexible Fund Allocation, or RUFA, program direction. And ultimately, this program direction documents how the region will expend regional flexible funds, which, to note, are federal transportation dollars, in a manner that advances the goals, priorities, and policy objectives of the regional transportation plan. So as part of that program direction, it sets the objectives of the Regional Flexible Fund allocation process, linking really the outcomes of the entire Regional Flexible Fund allocation to achieve those RTP goals. Excuse me, I'm trying to just move a couple of things here to be able to see my talking points, which I'm struggling to do at this moment with my screens. There we are. Thank you. The program direction also largely defines the funding categories within the Regional Flexible Fund allocation, and it provides the estimated amounts within each funding category. This is something you might be familiar hearing the language around what we call step 1 and step 2 in terms of the definition of those funding categories. And again, if you're interested in reading more about the program direction, that information can be found on page 2 of the JPAC memo, which was submitted as part of the C4 materials for today. So going into this 2028 through 2030 cycle, the estimated amount of regional flexible funds sits at about 150 to 153 million for the 3-year allocation. This roughly translates into about 5% of the transportation funding spent in the region in the given 3-year period. That the roughly 150 to 153, that total amount roughly gets split between 3 categories. So we have what we call step 1A, and that's the region's bonding repayment commitment, which for fiscal years 2028 through 30 is about 52 million. And again, that payment is really due to previous allocation decisions that were made in earlier RUFA cycles. Then we have what's called step 1B, which are various region-wide programs and regional planning activities, which, if kept at their current existing operating levels, is about $41 million. That leaves the remaining discretionary amount at about 60 million for new initiatives or if no action is taken to step 2 capital grants for local projects, which may be the process folks around this table are most familiar with. So as we began the development of the program direction for the 2028 through 2030 REFUS cycle, we have an existing program direction that we're really drawing from as our starting point. Unless the region chooses to modify that existing direction, the elements of that program direction really just gets carried over into this upcoming cycle. So right now, what we're seeing is getting carried over is really the investment into the region-wide programs and planning activities as represented in Step 1B. This also includes a number of allocation objectives to maintain our federal eligibility, which really have a very large role in dictating these funds. So some of those examples include awarding a pool of projects which are eligible for federal transportation, specific transportation funds, as well as awarding funding throughout the region without utilizing suballocation. And lastly, that third item that's really being carried over are decisions around capital projects in the Step 2 allocation are really focused in and assessing and emphasizing the ability for those projects to make it through the federal aid process while maintaining the proposed scope and budget. So those are kind of the elements of the program direction that we're seeing right now, likely to carry over into this cycle. However, when we launched the update of this process in February, Metro began a conversation with regional partners for the upcoming cycle and ultimately getting a sense of what worked from the last cycle, what do we look at potentially updating. Based on the input received thus far, partners have expressed a desire to modify aspects of the program direction in efforts to advance RTP regional transportation plan outcomes, and also to make the Step 2 allocation process work a little better. So in light of that feedback, Metro staff looked through what opportunities and options were available based on that information, and we've identified kind of 3 main areas where there's some potential opportunities. So the first is pursuing a new project bond as part of Step 1A. The second is an option to update and revise the technical evaluation criteria for the Step 2 applications. And then the third is the option related to the Step 2 cycle objectives and updating how we run the Step 2 process. We put a short summary of these program direction options on page 2 of the JPAC materials that were submitted for this meeting. For the remainder of this presentation, I'm really just going to focus and discuss a little bit on, or discuss the first and the third options. And then lastly, as I walk into the discussion and start talking a little more in detail about them, I want to emphasize these options are not formal proposals. They're really being put out there to help prompt a discussion and help gather further input from regional partners so we can move towards developing a draft program direction. So the first one, discussing a new project bond, which is significant. Their first option is the development of a new project bond, which would make available an upfront amount of funding for a regional project or projects in exchange for a new dedication of regional flexible fund payments into the future. Regional partners expressed an interest in this option by utilizing the capacity created by the reduction in the dedicated payments for this upcoming cycle to our existing bond commitments. So ultimately, what we're seeing is that we have a number of project bond commitments and we have a dedicated payment schedule, and that schedule starts to drop slightly starting in 2028. That drop over 3 years, what that looks like compared to the previous 3 years is about $13.5 million. And also just to note, this strategy of bonding to help provide upfront funding for regional projects is not new. There's region has strategically utilized project bonding to leverage additional federal and state funding and efforts to build out a number of different regional projects, including the region's high capacity transit system, the Better Bus program, and also early project development into OR 217, Rose Quarter, and I-205. So a new project bond is really an interesting idea in the sense that it's asking us to consider bringing forward money now with a dedication into the future, and knowing that there are a number of different factors and risks that are associated with a decision to move forward with some sort of project bonding option. So really, probably the most significant one to note is that to secure a project bond, payment to the bonded debt services ultimately receive first priority of available regional flexible funds. This really can mean a range of outcomes then that implicate step 1B, the region-wide programs and planning activities, as well as step 2, our capital grant allocation and program for local projects. Managing this is really going to be based on how well the region gets right our projected federal revenues into those future years, and really looking at how well our projections are meeting the actuals when we get closer to that later date. So in this case, we're talking about in 2028 and then beyond. With that said, knowing that there are risks associated, obviously there are very rational reasons to pursue a new project bond, and it's why it's being presented as an option for discussion for the upcoming 2028 through 2030 Regional Flexible Fund Allocation program direction. So knowing these factors, the question that is in front of the regional table currently is, does the region develop a new project bond? Pursue a new project bond and develop a project bond proposal. And that project bond proposal would ultimately identify and outline the different regional projects which would receive bond proceeds. So the third component to this discussion around this question around a new project bond is, if the region says, yes, let's go ahead and pursue a new project bond, and let's go ahead and undertake the effort to develop that new project bond proposal. Having some direction as to how to develop that proposal, would really be helpful in being able to move that process forward. And ultimately, what we want to do is to make sure that whatever proposal that gets developed is really guided by principles that address a good administrative practices and our regional flexible fund allocation program direction objectives. So a list of these principles are on page 4 of the JPAC memo that was submitted for this meeting, but I'll go through a couple of them just for your just to kind of walk through some examples that we're talking about, and you can really, again, take a look at the others that are listed. But some principles that are being put out there are maintaining an acceptable level of risk to ensure a new project bond doesn't significantly impact the activities for step 1B, as well as the step 2 allocation. Then there's another principle that we want to really advance regional scale projects, and particularly those which advance our regional transportation plan priority goal areas and outcomes. And also just really noting with that principle that making a new bond commitment should not be just for any project, but a significant investment towards regional projects, which would make big strides to our regional transportation plan goals. Another principle is, recognizing that we're in a very constrained transportation revenue environment currently, and so ultimately, in making a decision to advance available funding, we should really use that advanced funding strategically in a way to secure other funds that would otherwise not come to the region. And then lastly, the last example I'll note here is that we'd want to actually gather input through a public comment opportunity on the projects proposed to receive the proceeds from a new project bond. So that's the overview of that option. Just briefly going into that second option, again, I'm just going to touch on this. The second option that's been put forward is really to identify and modify parts of the step 2 technical evaluation criteria. This is really in efforts to help align our technical evaluation towards the updates that were done as part of the adoption of the 2023 Regional Transportation Plan. We ultimately knew that with the adoption of the 2023 RTP, there was a new goal area that was created. There was some slight modifications to a couple of the RTP goals, and ultimately we went through an exercise to see where did our previous technical evaluation criteria need some refinement and work in order to meet that alignment. A description of that can be found on page 4 of the materials. But one aspect I really wanted to note is that the technical evaluation criteria does not depart significantly from the evaluation criteria that was utilized in the previous cycle. What we are really trying to do is reorganize some aspects of the technical evaluation to kind of make things a bit more clear, while also incorporating feedback from partners about the technical evaluation that to address some areas where the technical evaluation had some blind spots and such. So there's that option. And then the third option, again, is related to step 2, and it's primarily around how we're going to conduct the process and essentially the main objectives for the step 2 capital grant allocations to local projects. They're described a bit more on page, the options are described a bit more on pages 4 and 5 of the JPAC memo. And if you want to go further into detail, they're also in attachment 2 of the JPAC packet as well. But in summary, Metro staff, as we were going around and starting this regional conversation about the upcoming cycle, we received a lot of comments relating to that step 2 process and the overall outcomes of the regional flexible funds allocations. So taking that input while also trying to, again, consider our federal requirements and obligations, it led to a few different options for administering step 2. Those includes increasing the minimum project cost thresholds for applications in step 2, having projects which were awarded funding in the previous regional flexible fund allocation cycle be ineligible to apply for funding for this upcoming cycle. And ultimately, this is in efforts to respond to input about having projects be awarded across the region and have greater reach. Reducing the number of applications from each subregion. I just want to note in the last cycle, there were none of the subregions actually reached their max number of applications they were allowed to submit. And so we were kind of looking at this as a potential way, in part, to facilitate another item, which is that Metro staff is we're seeking funding, so it's dependent on funding, to provide technical assistance for the application process for small jurisdictions. So being able to manage the number of applications would actually help support being able to manage some of that technical assistance work. And we'd also like to establish a pre-application process to help, to help identify that small jurisdiction technical assistance, and also being able to help identify like additional outreach that Metro staff would need to conduct in order to bring awareness about the upcoming step 2 process. So in short, these are the options for discussion that for coming to the regional table, and I'll be discussing these again tomorrow morning at JPACT. But just to briefly, before closing, some quick next steps. We're really still in this first main phase of our work as it relates to conducting the 2028 through 2030 Regional Flexible Fund allocation. It's really us getting that program direction completed will then help us move into that step 2 process. Metro staff plans to return to JPACT, so we'll be at JPACT tomorrow morning, but we'll also be there in May for further discussion around the options. So again, really trying to leave some room for discussion. And then our aim is for the June meeting to put forward a draft program direction and request action. Following the program direction, hopefully being completed in June or the actions being taken in June, we will really enter into the step 2 project selection process, and that will begin the solicitation for applications come in the fall of 2024, and we'll then do the subsequent technical evaluations, readiness assessment, and public comment, and that'll really roll us into spring of 2025. And then again, we'll look to begin the formal deliberation processes around step 2, beginning in spring of 2025 with an anticipated end date in summer of 2025. So in closing, here to gather your input and really appreciate your time.
Very, very good. Appreciate that that information. And I've got a number of questions, but I will defer to Commissioner Savas. We'll let him kick off the questions, please.
Yeah, Grace, thank you for your presentation, and I might be a little bit long-winded on this one, but I think I need to set the table from at least the perspective I sit at and watching this. So I would first want to say that the flexible funds becomes less flexible the more we bond or stay on the path of a step 1 type bonding program. So that does not give, I don't think that gives us the flexibility, especially with changing technologies, to adjust. Because you're making a long-term commitment with the bond, and so we have that. So with that said, and then looking at the percentages in the chart that you showed there, or that you referenced, my other question is going to be going forward is of course, is it looking back and analyzing, where geographically those investments were made, and also looking geographically where there's inequities in regional distribution of funds and or transit or whatever it may be. I am and have a huge focus on the carbon reduction aspects, and I referenced back several years ago at JPAC when I brought up the idea about charging stations, and if we're going to have electrification, realizing that in areas that are more suburban, the needs are going to be different than they are in metropolitan areas, and obviously realizing that years ago, in being in my engineering world, that hydrogen was something that is going to be coming about. I think everyone kind of their jaw dropped when I said that, because it's like, huh? Anyhow, and California is always been, so I won't say the tip of the spear, but pretty much in technology changes, and they're making huge advances in that. They're way ahead of us. And for that reason alone, I think that being flexible with a substantial amount of funds, because there's more money here than there probably is in a lot of other areas as far as what JPAC or Metro jointly can approve or steer one way or another. So that said, with all that said, I'm really, my question is going to be going forward again is analyzing where geographically those investments are and where they're potentially going to go, and how does that relate to a kind of a burning issue for me is getting some regional transportation balance. How do we make sure that our system's balanced? And the why that's important is when I hear from people, especially people that would be more relying on transit, marginalized communities, whether it's income level or color of skin or whatever it may be, those folks, and I hear from them saying, I don't have very many options. And I would argue that from listening to them that they are they are really not getting the transportation equity that other parts of the region, where they get in other parts of the region. So like folks, so our folks that live in Clackamas County have less transit per capita probably than other folks in the same in either income level or whatever it may be. So lots said there. I glad to hear that we have some time to be talking about this, but I'm hoping between that and the UPWP conversation, we can talk about trying to get some regional equity when it comes to distribution of transportation, availability of transportation, and those investments. And I would reckon, just to think, at least in my history of watching what has been done and invested in on bonding for step one, it has not made a geographic dent in Clackamas County. And so that said, sorry for being long-winded. Turn it over back to everyone else.
Very good. Thank you, Commissioner. Any thoughts or comments from my Metro friends on that, or okay, I appreciate that. So I do have a kind of what I'm trying to kind of understand, and apologize if this is my own naivete. So I like the idea of providing assistance to smaller jurisdictions, in the application process, but I also noticed that we are reducing the number of projects that are being able to be submitted by the jurisdictions, and we're increasing the size of the projects, the size, for planning or for construction. And so help me square that circle. To me, that's the exact opposite of what you would want to do for a smaller jurisdiction who may not have a project size capacity that would make sense here. So is it just what problems do those things solve for us? What's the positive outcome from making those maneuvers?
Sure, I think I can answer those very quickly. Part of the rational decision around the increase in the cost thresholds as it relates to the step 2 allocation that's being put out there as an option is really about being able to support projects moving through the federal aid process. We have to just remember these are federal dollars. And so, what we've historically seen with regional flexible fund allocations time and time over is that those small allocations for project development or projects that are that come in with a capital grant award and receive a capital grant award, with the intention it's thinking it's ultimately like this kind of size. Once it enters that federal aid process, because of all the necessary requirements that need to be met, suddenly the various costs just shoot up significantly. We also want to recognize too that, inflationary, project costs have ultimately gone up just because of the nature of how quickly we saw inflation rise. And so it seems like it would make a lot of sense that bringing that threshold upwards towards that would kind of make sense. So then really projects are coming, step 2 projects that come in with their scopes and budgets for being in consideration up here, ultimately can make it through that federal aid process if they're awarded and like deliver the scope as proposed. So that's the thinking around that. And then really around the reducing the number of applications. Part of that is really, what we saw is that in the previous cycle, we didn't receive kind of no subregion submitted more applications than what we had. And even if with the thinking about the possible reduction, it would still actually, based off of how last cycle happened, again, I know that could be a different environment that we're talking about. No one would have actually, or none of the subregions would have actually capped over even the number that we're proposing. We also want to recognize that we have a lot of smaller jurisdictions in our region that could really use the technical assistance and support. And in efforts, since we are trying to secure funding for this effort, we will have to be mindful of just knowing that this is not, we may not be able to support every jurisdiction if we had kind of a more open, just all the applications available. So we have been trying to think through how do we balance those two different objectives. I mean, I know they do seem a little counter to some of the other feedback about wanting to have more geographic reach, and but we're trying to find that sweet spot in the middle based off of the number of things that we've heard up to today.
Okay, because I mean, in my mind, it could certainly be a chicken and egg scenario where jurisdictions submit based on the number of applications they can submit. And so we wouldn't submit, we wouldn't take the time and effort to submit 40% more than our limitation, knowing that they're going to be, eliminated from that. So bringing that number down may just reduce the number of applications that we even, bother to move forward. And what I hear you say, which I think makes better sense to me, is it's also a capacity limitation. That's about how much staff resources and time that we can put forth to this. So I appreciate that. So does a project have to be on the RTP to be submitted for this in advance, or does it not matter?
Yes, everything, the regional flexible funds, to be eligible for the regional flexible funds, that's kind of getting to that. We got to meet those minimum federal requirements. The project that's being submitted in step 2 would need to be a project that was included included in the financially constrained RTP. Now, the RTP, obviously, there's not like I know in the RTP sometimes there's like what we call like buckets for very small sets of projects, or revenue buckets, where it may be something like general sidewalk infill in this given area, and ultimately you're thinking about a step 2 project that may be this sidewalk infill complete street. Like, there's a drawn connection that can be made in some cases. So it doesn't have to be an exact 1-for-1 match, because we recognize realistically the fund source that we have is it may be one small component of a larger project. It might be so small that the RTP doesn't have it as an individual project. So
okay, so do I understand that correctly? The answer is not necessarily, but it should be.
I would say that yes, it needs to be drawn from the RTP, but I think there's a little bit of flexibility there, in the sense of, does it have to be a 1-to-1 match? Not necessarily in terms of the actual like name. If it's pretty consistent in terms of its scope and geographic area that was identified, then it would largely meet that requirement.
Okay, I mean, and then I guess maybe one final thought or question, and just on the bonding side, as an outsider looking in, I would assume that the interest rate environment today versus years ago produces a very significant outcome of resources for us when we go bond, and a very significant differential in the bonding cost going forward. So, and there was a chart that you produced in that showed if we bonded at, if we don't have a bond, if we bond at a limited level, a significant level, and the proceeds were 55 million and 105 million, and the trade-off seemed to be 10 million a year plus or minus going forward. So I would assume then that the limited bond is a shorter duration, the bigger bond is longer duration if the cost is generally the same on a year-over-year basis. What I didn't see, and maybe I just missed it, was what's the total cost of that? What do we give away? I mean, so I know that you had mentioned there is some federal funding, additional federal funding that comes from that immediacy of the capital that's available. Can I hear that right? And that's part of the reason why bonding may be a good thing, is you can do things more quickly. I'm always curious. So when I see the differential that it potentially might cost us, 10, 15, $20 million a year in the future of potential project funding that we give up for today, I'm just kind of curious, what's that trade-off? So is there a chart that I missed along the way that kind of shows me what the cost is of that bond over the full timing of that bond, and what we give away by tapping our credit card today versus saving money and doing it over a longer period of time? And I also don't know, I'm sure we have an ample number of projects out there. Do we bond based on the demand, or we bond based on how palatable it is, and then we backfill with projects going forward? Sorry, lots of questions.
Lots of questions there. I will try to answer a couple very quickly, but I'm going to really look to Ted here, because he is much more the bonding expert in all of this. The question as it relates to try to what is the overall cost that we're really talking about if we make this decision to move forward with a bond is really the cost really is, as I mentioned in my presentation, it's about how well we actually hit our revenue projections for federal transportation dollars to when we actually meet that actual, because what we could potentially see, and then the size of the bond actually plays like a major role in ultimately what the risk and impact could be. If we get our projection, long story short, if we get our federal projections wrong for say 2028, and we somehow over project revenues, I think is the way, we could be seeing pretty significant impacts in future cycles. So we'd be talking about maybe the 2031 through 33 RUFA cycle, where step 2 might go from being a program that has traditionally been about $40 to $55 million, be more like $30 million. And I think that's what that table in the attachments was trying to express, but it's a little it's a bit complicated in trying to express that kind of detail in a simplified visual format. If they're actually pretty close to what we think the projected federal revenues are come 2028, we may see a pretty stable flex fund program as is that we have currently, essentially, and as what we ultimately have allocated. So Ted, I'm gonna hopefully I didn't get myself in any water.
No, I think that's the risk that we're trying to manage. Is we are forecasting that level of federal funding we're expecting to come in, and so depending on how that performs relative to the size of the bonding commitment we make, that's the risk we're trying to manage, right? And so, in terms of risk management, what that analysis was showing is we can probably bond a modest amount of funding, not the higher end. That $105 million is on the higher end. That was showing pretty much we'd have an impact on step 2 in those future cycles if we tried to bond that amount, and we didn't perform on the revenue side with sort of a more optimistic growth revenue forecast. That if we're, something like more flat or have a reduction in federal funds, then we would have an impact bonding at that level in future funding cycles. Whereas if we're at a more modest amount and we do okay, and we have sort of a flat or a growing federal revenues, we'll be okay in terms of not having a big impact on step 2 in future funding cycles. So that's sort of that risk management part. In terms of costs, again, we're just in terms of the risk assessment, we were just sort of looking at existing conditions today. If we were to go out and bond today, plus we gave ourselves a little bit of cushion in terms of that cost. And generally, in rough terms, you're looking at it's going to cost you over the life cycle of the bond. It's going to cost you about $4 for every $2.50 to $3 you're going to get up front, right? And so, but you're also getting those dollars at today's purchasing power rather than at future purchasing power, where you've had, we expect inflation to reduce the purchasing power in those future years anyway. So, that's always a risk management game as well, in terms of, do you get a good bond rate relative to inflation over time?
Sure.
So that,
No,
yeah. So, but roughly that's kind of what you're looking at in terms of that if you want to talk about cost. So
okay.
did that hit your points?
It hit, definitely nibbles around the edges, and I appreciate that. I'm going to submit some written stuff later on, and we'll, that'll give us more time to go through this. I just want to keep this moving along. So Councilor Pratt, you're next up, please.
Oh, hi. I'm wondering, I'm trying to understand what you use the term regional outcomes and priority regional outcomes. So how do you define that? Like, is that if the project has an impact on the whole region, and what goal is that? Is that like traffic reduction, carbon reduction? And if that's the case, then how would small projects ever get looked at, I guess?
You want to take that one, Grace?
Sure. I think I'm following the question. I'm not sure if it's specific around the bonding, or if it's
Just
more.
the term, what priority regional outcomes, how you define that.
Well, I mean, ultimately, that's a long-winded way of saying our regional transportation plan goals, which center around safe system, equitable transportation, climate action and resiliency, mobility options, and thriving economy. And there's a fuller description about what those are.
So it's meeting those goals.
Yeah, it's essentially making sure that we can directly show a linkage to, once we're done, we complete the allocation. Can we say that these projects can directly link to advancing the goals of the RTP?
And then I guess I'm trying to understand, if you, in doing that, so do you try to be throughout the region, as you, like, if you have this bond, would you try to allocate these funds throughout the whole metro region? Is that a priority or a part of the process?
I think a number of the process details are currently, I think this is probably feedback that we'd want to hear. And, these details haven't been developed. I think the way that we're starting this discussion is much more, do we want to actually pursue the development of a bond proposal? Because we recognize that it's a significant undertaking, and it's a significant trade-off that I think Councilor Sherman immediately like what does it cost us right now?
So yeah, then the bond, you were saying for every $3 we get, it'd be $4 outlay, approximately. I know rates are variable, but okay. Well, thank you.
And I would just say, just to add to that, yes, one of the things that we've carried forward in all past RUFA cycles that we're proposing to carry forward today for the entire allocation is one of the objectives is that we fund projects throughout the region. That's the combination of things that we do with a bonding proposal or with the step 2 projects. However, we're balancing that objective of funding projects across the region with the federal regulation that we can't suballocate these funds, right? We can't just say, hey, it would be really easy just to give Clackamas County, 18% of the money based on that percent of the population being in Clackamas County, and everybody just get their share geographically. We can't do that. It's illegal for us to do. So we have to balance that objective of funding and getting results across the region, but also knowing that we can't do that sub-allocation.
Very good. Good information. Mayor Buck, you have the floor.
Thanks, Councilor Sherman. I had a lot of the same questions that Councilor Sherman had around the seeming kind of contradiction in some of the goals and those kind of step 2 criteria. And I guess I just want to clarify the $1 million, these are kind of project planning dollars. Yeah. And I have to say, for kind of some of these local projects, I mean, $1 million from project planning, I mean, that's hard to hit. Yeah.
Are you
I just
saying-
are we talking about project planning dollars? I mean, we would rarely even spend $1 million on project planning.
I guess maybe to help for clarifying is that would be the project costs would need to be encompassing both the requested regional flexible fund allocation as well as the local match. So it's not an expectation that it's a minimum $1 million of local match into a project. I just want to, hopefully I'm not.
But it's $1 million. We're not talking total project cost, right? This is like planning dollars.
Project
Well, so-
development dollars, correct?
Yeah, that would be for project development specifically is what we're looking at. And
I guess-
again,
Mhm.
we're really basing this decision about through previous experiences of previous project development awards. It's the smaller dollars just struggle. Smaller dollar projects just tend to struggle a lot more getting through the federal aid process because they are small. I mean, it's
Right.
a small project. And so there's a strategy around that. Once you're looking to enter the federal aid process, it's a very different world compared to using local dollars, which I recognize is also very constrained.
Well, I know. Well, I mean, honestly, I think we all know you can't even get, an ODOT grant without, like doubling the cost of your project because of all the requirements they put on it. And I think some of that may have to do with where ODOT gets their where they get their money too. So, but I just want to, I guess that pre-application process, would make that, important. Maybe some of this could be explained and maybe be more project specific. I'll be honest, like this is a difficult conversation. This is like telling your kids, like, would you rather have one big present for Christmas or a lot of smaller presents for Christmas? And they're going to say, well, it depends on what the presents are. Like, what's the big present, right? So it's difficult to have a conversation not knowing the projects. Commissioner Savas, like I think he put his point in the chat. It'd be great to see like what have been the large projects that we bonded on with these funds. What are some of those examples? What are the projects that we're looking at? Because all of these projects have an impact. Whether they're large projects have an impact, the smaller projects have an impact too, right? And meeting the goals of the RTP. So it's hard to, I mean, how do you move forward really not understanding, well, what are we looking at right now? This cycle, this period of time, what are these what's the big project? Is it a big project? Is it several medium-sized projects? What are then the small projects that we'd be, or the smaller type projects we'd be giving up? It would be helpful to have more kind of concrete on the ground information than this kind of theoretical 50,000 foot level discussion.
So let me jump in and maybe help provide some clarity around that. Think about it differently for the question being asked for whether to pursue a bond proposal, because at this stage we are more theoretical, but typically those are for large regional scale, corridor scale projects, right? So think about the Milwaukee Light Rail line received a very large regional allocation from this bonding process in the past. Bus rapid transit corridors. Those are the scale of projects that have been funded in the past with the bonding. Now, asking about, you also mentioned some of the step 2 projects and, should we raise the minimum threshold on that? That's sort of a separate conversation. Those are the smaller scale projects. But as we've said, any project that enters the federal aid process sort of has a base level of costs that get attached with that to document that you're following all the federal aid rules and are meeting, those sort of minimum thresholds of getting that project through the project development and construction process. So for the step 2 questions, we're talking about much smaller scale. Mm-hmm. And those are probably more of the projects you're familiar with from the past in terms of, the recent applications you've done for, Willamette Boulevard in West Lynn, and those types of projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Very good. Good, robust conversation. Appreciate that. We are kind of bumping up time-wise. Commissioner Savas, I will give you the final floor.
Sure. As I mentioned in the chat early on, I think we should take a lot of great questions. So, I don't know who can assign themselves to maybe gathering these all up and submitting them so we can put together something either coming from C4 or coming from our C4 Metro Subcommittee or individually from our cities, however that's done. But I'd like to make sure we capture all that. Ted, I appreciate your comment. I've heard it before. I certainly understand that having an allocation, sub-regional allocation is not necessarily legal. Get that totally. But the same token is, I think overall, and this affects not just Rough-Up, but a number of things, is that this is somewhat to Mayor Buck's point, is that the challenge for smaller jurisdictions is not either having the resources or the staffing or whatnot to do this. So I think we can look not way back, but look in the recent past and say, how's that working out for us, right? I mean, we can't not recognize that the region from a transportation standpoint, where we look at roads, highways, transit, whatever it may be, that this region's lopsided. Most of those investments are in one particular part of the region. And if we don't recognize that, or we don't invest in balancing that, then we are just setting ourselves up for the larger jurisdictions to have the huge staffing and have the huge resources getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the smaller jurisdictions being farther and farther and farther behind. That's the path we're on. And I think that if the region does not want to recognize that, and let's say the region, I don't know how, with one city from each county at the table and one county from each part of the region at the table, it's very difficult to have a good conversation about that. A goal, not sure, because it's hasn't been adopted as a regional goal, but trying to get some regional balance. And I don't see any movement in that direction at the table. That's not a staff problem. That's really a problem for us at the JPAC table, but other MPOs in the country have a far greater representation at their tables, by the way, folks. And I think they've been more effective having more regional voices, which are geographic in the end, but we don't have very many voices for each of the counties. 2 people at table and per county, and you have to ask yourself, how do we get here? And I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Very good. I appreciate that feedback. We will table this one for the time being and jump ahead to our next agenda item. Ted, Grace, thank you so much for presenting today. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Next up, we've got John Merman with us from Metro, is going to give us a UPWP program approval update. So, when we refer to programs like REFA and JPAC, do you refer to this as UPWUP?
No, just UPWP.
That's just no fun, but I appreciate that. All right, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much for having me. I'm John Merman, Transportation Planner at Metro. Trent's going to share some slides for you. Great. So Karen Burek asked me to come in today to give you an overview of the Unified Planning Work Program, which will be discussed at JPAC this week and will be up for adoption next month. You can find the full document in the JPAC packet for this week. My plan today is just to briefly walk through what the document is, how it's laid out, and describe the adoption process. Next slide, please. Going to advance that. Great. So what is UPWP? It's a document required that every year that we produce, required by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Helps us ensure we're spending federal planning dollars efficiently, describes all the transportation planning work going on around the region. At JPAC meetings throughout the year, there'll be presentations that relate to many of these planning projects at key stages and milestones. This is the document where we summarize the work plans and budgets for all these projects and describe how they relate to each other. Next slide. So with that in mind, I always need to have this slide describing what the UPWP is not doing. It's not establishing any regional policies. It's not making funding allocation decisions. Regional policies are set in the Regional Transportation Plan. Funding allocations happen in things like RUPA, which you were just hearing about from Grace and Ted. The UPWP doesn't include construction, design, or preliminary engineering. It's just transportation planning projects for the upcoming fiscal year of regional significance and mainly federally funded work. Next slide, please. So the document is laid out, begins with an introduction, providing context about our region and what the federal requirements are for this kind of work. And then the body of the document is 5 different sections. First, Metro-led region-wide planning. So things like our Transportation System Management Operations Program or Regional Travel Options Program. Then we've got Metro-led corridor and area specific planning. Like examples would be the TV Highway Plan or the 82nd Avenue Plan. Then we've got administration and support at Metro. So that's like our modeling group, transportation modeling, our data management folks. Next, there's state-led planning of regional significance. So these are the ODOT-led projects going on in our region, things like the I-5 Boone Bridge planning work, for example. Lastly, there's a locally led planning of regional significance. So an example in your neck of the woods would be Clackamas County's Sunrise Gateway Corridor Planning Visioning Project. Next slide, please. So TPAC made a recommendation in April for approval of the draft Unified Planning Work Program. And they were, at the time, they incorporated refinements identified during the comment period. These were kind of minor clarification and ease of review comments, things to make things more clear, nothing big. The comments came in from TPAC members, as well as the agencies that participate in our annual consultation we do with the US DOT, ODOT. Yeah, so we incorporated all those in. TPAC recommended they go forward. Karen also suggested that I point out anything new in the UPWP this year, any new planning projects for the upcoming fiscal year. And the two I would draw your attention to are regional industrial lands availability and intermodal facilities access study. If you're looking at the UPWP document, it's on page 55 of that. Tim O'Brien at Metro is the contact to learn more about it if you're curious and want to follow up. And the other new project is TriMet's Frequent Express Bus System Plan. That's on page 103 of the UPWP. And Jonathan Plowman at TriMet's the contact. That project, TriMet, in coordination with Metro, will outline a vision of a network of frequent express, or FX as it's called, bus service across the region. Next slide, please. So this is the remaining steps that will lead to the UPWP adoption in May, and then transmittal to the US DOT in time to keep the federal planning dollars flowing to our region. We need to have that done before July 1st. Yeah, so JPAC will discuss it this week, and we'll ask for action from JPAC and Metro Council in May. And with that, I think I'll wrap up and see if there are any questions.
Very good. Thank you, John, for the presentation. I'll open the floor. Anybody have any questions or comments? Oh, don't let them off that easy. Come on. There we go. Mayor Milch, you're on.
So just to clarify, so this is really a test of whether you're compliant with certain things, and somebody reads this and reviews it. And what happens next? Is there a possibility that would say, wait a minute, this project is way out of bounds and doesn't follow the rules, and so you can't do it? Or yes, these projects are all, in accordance with what we expect, and the funding will continue to flow? Just what's the result of submitting this to the two larger Department of Transportation DOT agencies?
It's federally required for us to keep receiving federal money. That this is one of our core responsibilities as a metropolitan planning organization. In addition to producing a regional transportation plan and an MTIP, Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program, we have to do this Unified Planning Work Program. So it summarizes all the planning work going on. And at the same time that we adopt this UPWP, we have a self-certification. We do this at the same time that shows that we're following all federal planning requirements. So it's something we need to do, and we get input along the way, but it isn't setting new policies, or it's not going to be rejected by the USDOT, but it's something that's helpful and they want to see from us and require of us to make sure we're spending planning dollars in a coordinated way. That makes sense.
Very good. Makes sense. Any other questions or comments for John today? All right. Thank you very much for sharing. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
All right. So moving things forward, we've got, Karen and Jamie coming up with a TPAC update.
I also have an update for you. I don't know if the packet's there, but one more piece at JPAC that you'll see tomorrow is this ongoing conversation on regional transportation planning. And that really is a set of informational meetings that's moving JPAC toward some sort of regional coordination to get ready for the 2025 transportation package. And last month you heard ODOT come and speak about their funding cliff and their transportation funding woes. And we're familiar with some of those because we've heard it, adjacent with the tolling conversation. So they were able to present that sort of statewide perspective. And this coming week at JPAC, there will be a conversation from Association of Oregon Counties, and I think the League of Cities will join them too. And so that is going to be a similar but different conversation. Again, trying to give that broader statewide perspective of like how and y'all know this better than most because of most of your agencies, but how is transportation funded across the state? How is it funded locally? What resources do you have? And really, it's an opportunity to reiterate to folks at the regional table, who are not all cities and counties, right? That those funding buckets, they're intertwined, they're married together. You can't really have one without the other. And so if there's a funding cliff for ODOT, there is a funding cliff for cities and counties, because of, how things are funded. And so this really is going to be a stair step of meetings that's moving JPAC towards, what will be your regional transportation priority for the 2025 package. And what I would encourage you to think about is LOC and AOC, they're going to come to this meeting on Thursday, tomorrow, and really offer that sort of statewide perspective. I don't think that they're going to get into the weeds of trying to say, regional versus rural, or, Ben's needs versus the metro area's needs. They have a more global perspective. And so what I would encourage y'all to think about, and maybe y'all want to think about it here, is how to help that conversation narrow in on what that means also for the region, and what the cities and counties of the region's role is to play on top of what AOC and LOC presents. So I think that's your opportunity tomorrow. You don't have to do it tomorrow. There will be more stair steps to get to ultimately what JPAC's opportunity to present some sort of regional recommendation. The last that I heard is that a first effort to make that regional recommendation, or to start looking at a regional recommendation, would be July, the JPAC meeting in July. And the good opportunity there is that, working backwards, C4 will have its retreat in June. And so there's opportunities to have more of a local conversation about what we want or what we need as a group, to then take that to the JPAC table, elevate it to a regional set, and then, the state will continue to stair step it towards 2025. So start small, get bigger, get a little bit bigger, but here in the beginning, have this opportunity to really know what we want and need as a group, counties, cities within Clackamas County, and present that to the regional priority sets, and then present that to the state and work through a process. So we're thinking about that at the staff level, of how to keep us on a set of correct dominoes falling in the right way. But here's a good first opportunity to really highlight those city and county funding scenarios and what that looks like for you, and then how to level it up to be specific to the region. So I wanted to share that before you go into that conversation tomorrow.
Very good. Commissioner Sanis.
Yeah, I've been struggling with this. I've been sharing my concerns with a few people. About 2 Mondays ago, I was in Kaiser for the ODOT's modal act chairs and modal chairs meeting. We used to do them like once a year. Now I think they're timing them to be quarterly now. So we'll see how that goes. But this topic came up a little bit with regard to ODOT's funding crisis, and they've done a good job getting statewide attention about their funding crisis, which really is our funding crisis as well. because we're so connected to the gas tax dollars. And so I appreciate what Trent's saying. And when I think about JPAC, we have Vancouver, Southwest Washington at the JPAC table as a member, but they're not attached to the Oregon gas tax dollars. In the Region 1 Act, we have Hood River County, who is part of the Region 1 Act, but they're not so connected to the commute shed. And the commute shed is both, largely made up population wise of the metro region, but geographically, it's far greater than just the metro region. And there's 25 cities in the metro JPAC area, if you will, metro boundaries, and yet there's a lot more cities on the periphery. So how do we present legislatively or to ODOT the voice of the commute shed jurisdictions, counties and cities in a way that the AOC folks are in a difficult position? Because Trent's right. They have more of a global state perspective. They don't have that unique, and we're a unique region in the state. So I think, how do we assemble our voice and get that out there is a question that I think, I don't want to form another group, but how do we get a coalition of all those voices together to make that point? I'll just stop there.
Very good. Appreciate that. I think a C4 Metro subcommittee is a perfect next step in this process. I will turn the floor over to Karen and Jamie. Karen, I can't help but notice that your title gets longer and longer over time, which means you're obviously much more important than you were last time you were here. So please.
Obviously. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all. Today, we actually have a special guest with us here today. Will Farley from Lake Oswego also has joined us because he is the alternate to the city's representative at TPAC, and he attended last TPAC meeting and was a primary author in this month's TPAC report. And as you all know, there is a TPAC report within your packet. It is on page 30, PDF page 37. And as usual, it has a lot of great information. Two of the items that were presented here today were talked about at TPAC as well. There's some and that being the UPWP as well as the RFFA program direction. The one thing that I wanted to highlight actually was some of the general updates, and it's actually things that we didn't have the opportunity to talk about in great detail because there had been an item on the TPAC agenda that was about the new federal greenhouse gas performance target setting. But unfortunately, there have been some challenges across the United States to this target setting. And so they pulled that agenda item from our conversation. We also did hear about some grant applications that had been made for the climate pollution reduction grant program. And one of the things I think that all of this highlighted was the fact that there are a lot of conversations about greenhouse gas reduction in several different venues and in several different ways, at the regional level, at the state level. And there may be value in being able to have a place where we are able to talk about these items specifically. So we brought forward a concept of perhaps as someone had just said this, a subcommittee of a subcommittee, but perhaps there is a place that we can be learning and moving forward and talking about the various actions about greenhouse gas reduction. So with that, that's the few things that I would say. I'm going to pass it over to Will and Jamie to see if they have additional things that they would like to highlight about the TPAC meeting.
I'll defer to Will. Sorry, Jamie Lorenzini, Happy Valley. Jumping in real quick. Will represented Clackamas cities at the last meeting, but I would like to flag one element that was in the TPAC packet material. And every month TPAC receives a fatality report of people who have passed in traffic deaths in the 3-county area. And in the March traffic death report, which also included February, there were, I think, 4 fatalities in Clackamas County, 2 of which were pedestrians, and 1 of which involved a 5-year-old, which is pretty upsetting, and I want to recognize. So it's just something to be aware of moving forward, that as we continue to discuss safety, thinking creatively about how do we protect vulnerable users in our transportation system, including people who are young, people who are older, people who are walking, and maybe people who are walking who, by the nature of the transportation mode, have less tolerance for traffic impacts than people who have a crunch zone in a vehicle. And I think that's something that our region continues to discuss. But with this report, typically I see fewer fatalities reported for the Clackamas area as opposed to other counties in our region. So it's just something to be aware of. Will, do you have any insights?
On which part? I'm just trying to figure out which part you want me to have insights, the fatality report or the rest of the TPAC meeting. I did like that the fact that we're going over highlights after the fatalities of what improvements we are, or what we're doing to try to reduce the deaths in the region. So we did go over the highlights of like Clackamas County's traffic safety videos, kind of the upcoming Oregon Active Transportation Summit, and the City of Portland's Rest on Red initiative. So they're trying to show, after these fatality reports, what are we doing? What are some of the actions that we're doing to kind of improve or reduce our fatalities on our streets? It's a welcome addition to kind of see what strides we're making to make our streets a safer place. As for the rest of the TPAC meeting, I believe all the counselors, commissioners, and mayors here got pretty much the same report that we got at TPAC about the UPWP and the Regional Flexible Funds direction. I didn't hear anything new in your briefing this morning, and there was a lot of great questions at this table that a lot of your members at TPAC had for Metro. That's about all that I would have to update.
Very good. I appreciate that. So, you know, if we have, and I think this kind of gets back to Commissioner Savas talking about putting together some questions for Metro on like, you know, the RIPA process. You know, if we have consistent questions that are coming up across multiple, you know, committees, are we getting answers to those? You know, are we actually, or is it just going to the next committee and we're asking the same questions and they're saying, yeah, it's a good question, you know? And so I do think if we're able to formalize those questions and submit them for response, that might be very helpful. So Commissioner Savas, please.
Yeah, couple things I want to just touch on. The first one to Jamie's point about the fatalities. It's been my observation, not just at this last couple of years of announcing the list of the traffic deaths at the beginning of the JPAC meeting, but far prior to that, I've been doing a lot of sitting down with our transportation staff, sitting down with emergency providers all around the county, and asking ourselves, how come sometimes we have these traffic fatalities or accidents, and yet they're not showing up anywhere, right? They're not really reported. They're not in a database of ODOT and so forth. So we had a project here several years ago, a private development project. It was an area where there's been a number of severe accidents, and I went to find the list of accidents at this location, some of which I witnessed because it's close to where I walk, where I live, and I couldn't find any of them. So as I talk to emergency providers, as I talk to our staff, as I talk to ODOT staff, you know, some of these don't make it. So I am concerned that, you know, that as we watch that scrolling down of the JPAC fatalities opening of the meeting, there are significantly more, and it's a bigger region and population, it stands to reason, but I don't know that that's really reflective of all the fatalities. So, and that probably goes for other counties as well. There's probably a lot more that's not reported. So I don't mean that that's Clackamas County specific. It's just the nature of that. So perhaps that's a different topic for a different day, but it is sad. I don't know if you all heard in the newspaper, there was another fatality down the street from, right near Milwaukee Oak Grove, where a gentleman decided to cross McLaughlin Boulevard between two areas where there was a crossing, one of which I advocated for and fought hard for at the state level to get funded in Milwaukee, right where and we built a trail and a light, and we really needed to have a connection, a safe pedestrian connection. And yet this person who lived in that area we were trying to serve unfortunately chose not to use the crosswalk that we spent well over $1 million on. Lots said, but shifting over to this subcommittee of a subcommittee, I'm wondering if there is, and I'm asking staff here, if there is any possibility that counties and cities, whether they're TPAC members or whether they're, transportation minded folks, can we organize a coalition of staff and elected folks that are cities and counties that represent this greater region, not just Clackamas, but all of us, that can be just prepare for this 2025 discussion as it relates to the impacts for our local jurisdictions, the 50-30-20 split being threatened or whatever it may be. But it seems to me that we don't have really that great of a city county. Well, we have a county representation at JPAC, but we don't have that, majority of cities being represented in any way at the JPAC table. So we have 3 cities that are represented at the JPAC table, but we have 25 cities in the region. How do we get that voice elevated? And I'm worried about being the state drowning out the voices of cities and counties in this statewide conversation if we don't make a stronger presence and a stronger argument for this region.
I want to jump in and try to answer that question about what's currently happening, and then really I might need to leave it to you and Mayor Buck and Councilor Lewis, to go to that JPAC meeting to advocate for something similar but different if that's really a desire of this group. There are a regional lobby table, focused on 2025, who are those state employees who go and do that type of work. So I'm in that group. Metro has people in that group. And there's a few of us, but you're right, not every city has, government affairs office or a team like that. So recognizing that that is sort of a limited table, thinking about the right venue, but it's still a limited table. There's now an additional policy team that essentially was the group of folks who were thinking more at the policy level around the tolling conversation. So it was a good, solid, broader group of individuals that more cities have staff like this. To think about not just the technical implications, but the policy implications of those things. That group is also going to start meeting and working with the regional lobby table as well. So those powers combined will start to inform and work with TPAC. So it'll have this multi-tier staff level way to think about how to help inform what goes on at JPAC, what's presented at JPAC, to move the JPAC table forward. To your point, that doesn't solve sort of the elected representation across the region to think about that table. But that's the table that we have presently, unless maybe like the R1 Act wanted to do more. But that's what's currently set up. And if we wanted to go beyond that as a region, that would probably need to be a discussion at the JPAC table. And so that's something you could bring tomorrow. But I wanted to give you the context of those other staff bodies that are starting to meet with a little bit more frequency, so that you know that it is bigger than just a few, folks at certain tables. There are multiple touch points happening right now.
Very good. Thank you for those comments. Councilor Berry.
Thank you. So I just wanted to touch on what Jamie had to say about the fatalities. That's just so sad. It touches, I think, probably all our hearts. I think it's Yeah, I mean, maybe this has already been done, but having a map and a list of where these accidents that are fatalities or where there's severe injuries would be really important, because one of our main goals should be safety and health. And so I would love to see that map and that list if it's available. Just, because we've talked about the bad accidents on 82nd and McLaughlin.
Yeah,
Very good.
that's a good point. I want to mention one other thing. It was a couple months or 3 months ago, maybe I raised it at the JPAC meeting, is that and I've lost 3 family members to car accidents, so they've been fatalities, but also have members that survived, and the permanent impacts to people that are still with us that have been injured are really not being recognized, and it's a greater number than the fatalities. So I think we need to be mindful that that almost say that there's a little bit greater recognition that as our traffic speeds are getting reduced, maybe we're having less fatalities, even though the fatality rates are higher than they were. I think the number of people injured or permanently suffer a handicap as a result of an injury of a vehicle accident or a pedestrian accident or a bicycling accident are really high. I just know too many people that it's changed their lives, not for the better, unfortunately. So I think just focusing on fatalities is not an accurate gauge of the entire picture of transportation safety.
Very good. Appreciate those comments. Okay, anything else on TPAC today? Very good. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. And finally, last and also least, MPAC update. Mayor Buck, you want to take this one today? No?
No, I didn't have anything prepared.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's okay. I've got it then. No problem at all. Come on, I mean, you're good at this stuff. So last MPAC meeting, I think, was back on March 27th. And I feel like I've given the same presentation to this group multiple times, which I think this is just a subset of C4. So you've all heard this good stuff before. But at last meeting, we had a housing update by the Chief Operating Officer, Marissa Madrigal. And that was really focusing on exploring kind of the affordable housing bond is coming up, is going to be done here in the near future. And so looking at options for future bonding capabilities. And so they're exploring kind of 3 base scenarios of either, do nothing, things stay the same with no future funding from that, issue another property tax bond going forward, similar to the one that they did back in 2018, or trying to expand the allowable uses of the supporting housing services income tax to fund housing. And so the COO is going to bring together elected leaders and various stakeholders to craft a recommendation to the Metro Council that I believe is going to come up for discussion in May. Councilor Lewis, am I remembering that correctly? Okay, good. So that'll be moving forward. I'm not sure from an engagement perspective if and how we'll be involved with that conversation, but I'm sure that is going to be kind of a work in progress as we move forward. We also had a legislative update, recap of kind of key issues with like the housing budget bill, which includes about $65 million for existing shelters over the next biennium. Also, $100 million in direct grants to cities for site-specific infrastructure investments. Also, SB 1537 established the whole Housing Accountability and Production Office, which we could talk about for hours, and I'm not going to talk about that at length today. But in theory, it's there to help smaller jurisdictions with that process. There are also a number of implications at kind of the local planning level, variances that have to be allowed, and it also provides for the potential for a one-time urban growth boundary expansion tool. And that actually kind of ties into, we also revisited the job and population forecast projections for the region, with kind of the conclusions being that population will still grow, albeit at a much slower level going forward. Employment growth is also expected to slow going forward as well. And in looking at the UGB capacity estimates for future housing capability over the next 20 years. They've done a number of studies to, or they did a number of scenarios to look at kind of the high versus the low estimates for potential growth before any expansions. And over the course of the next 20 years, the high estimate's about 175,000 unit capability. The low estimate's about 133,000 or so. And I, as we looked at that, and I kind of just translate that into what the governor's housing production goals are in the state. So I don't really know if that's applicable to the region, but her intention is 36,000 units a year over that time period. So this seems like those numbers are a mismatch. What I took away from the conversations about, this is my takeaway. This isn't what they specifically said, but the idea that growth is going to slow, that we're not going to see as much population growth through immigration and things like that in the area. My takeaway was, maybe we don't need to have that, those big adjustments to the urban growth boundary going forward, because we already kind of have the capacity. And I think that's going to be, a robust conversation going forward. Anybody have any comments on that or thoughts on that? I think I kind of captured all of them. Councilor Lewis, any thoughts on that?
I think you did a nice job. I wasn't at the meeting, but based off of my understanding the process, yes. And I think it's really important to see the role of MPACT as doing the work of engaging. And that's why you have Marisa Madrigal coming. That's why you have all of these reports. But if we need to have a one-off conversation at C4 Metro Sub or somewhere else, I think that's also appropriate. So thank you.
Very good. Mr. Wilson, you are first up. You just beat Commissioner Savas by seconds.
I won't be long, and I'm not asking a question. Your comment about the 36,000, units a year and the governor's goal, it's a good segue to what the C4 broader committee has approved for discussion at the upcoming retreat. And so I would encourage you, since you brought it up, take this opportunity to get ready for June and have a conversation around what's our role? What's our role in that at Clackamas County? And that's not been a conversation that has really happened here at C4. Where we do coordinate on growth, on land use, on transportation, and how that influences that type of growth. And so we're preparing conversations for that. And it would be nice maybe to borrow some of that data that Metro is providing to help inform some pieces of that conversation. But I would encourage each of the cities to get ready for, number one, a survey that will come out just after the May C4 meeting to start answering questions to help us think about that discussion. But just specifically, like Happy Valley, 36,000 units a year, what's your role? Lake Oswego, what's your role? Wilsonville, what's your role in that, broader production? Clackamas County, what's our role? So we don't have to have an answer for it today. Just wanted to flag that is a conversation that this group is moving towards. What is our role in that sort of math? So think about it. And that's all I wanted to share.
Very good. Appreciate that. Commissioner Savas, you get the last word today.
Yeah, I just, not a question to be answered today, but a question just to plant the seed. And that is that, am I mistaken in assuming that MPAC is the best place to raise the concern that we're building substantial amount of housing in this region and not requiring charging stations in light of the 11 years from now, every car sold will be electric, and most of the housing being built today is multifamily with less parking. And again, I think parking and charging stations have a relationship, right? I mean, wherever the charging station is, and I hear too many people saying, younger people saying, or apartment dwellers say, I can't buy an electric car because I have no place to charge it. When I get home, I can't plug it in. So it just seems to me, the question really is MPAC the right place to raise this at a higher level, or is it JPAC, or is it Region 1 Act, or is it at the state legislature, or is it part of the 2025 package? I don't know. But I think there's too many homes that are being built and no charging, and it's only 11 years away, folks.
Very good. Good comment, Mayor Buck.
Well, I believe that the CFEC rules, they do require new multifamily to be, I don't know, to, you know, have hundreds of chargers, but at least to have the infrastructure. I think they have to have it plumbed, you know, pipe for EV ready. And then, well, I mean, just anecdotally, we're seeing the new multifamily definitely come with charging just because market demand. I think it's the retrofitting the existing it's easy to retrofit a single family home with a charger. That I mean, you know, no problemo. But the existing multifamily is a huge issue. And we have tried locally to get folks to apply for grants, and there's like they just don't seem that motivated, which is unfortunate.
I appreciate that that comment. My daughter is down in LA in a condo. They have 2 chargers for their condo that are in the garage. It is effectively not usable because of the number of people with electric cars in that area that want to charge there. So she goes down to the local mall and sits in a queue in a line to wait a half an hour, 45 minutes to then have the opportunity to charge in a supercharger. So it becomes an hour, hour and a half process that you can't leave your car. You have to be there the entire time. I mean, and that's an area where they're really embracing it. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. Councilor Lewis.
Sure. In terms of the right place to make an impact, I mean, obviously CFEC rules, but also the state legislature has had bills on multifamily and charging, at least for 6 sessions. So it is of statewide conversation. If you're asking for the region to do something more or different than the state, I think it's a transportation policy question. So it should come to JPAC, and obviously in our RTP. We, from a Clackamas perspective, advocated for more emphasis on electrification in the RTP. So it's there as a subject that we've carved out room and a plan to work on. When it comes to the impact table, that's a good place to have a conversation that may spur cities to take action and have individual code revisions, unless it's deemed to be an area where there's regional concern and people think Metro needs to step up with a region-wide rulemaking or ordinance. I think at that point in time, the only impact would be on Metro-funded projects, which are not insignificant, but are not what you're trying to get at. So if you want to be more than just advisory to cities that are at the table, if you want to be more than just making an impact on Metro funded housing, I'd say bring it up at JPAC as well as MPAC.
Very good. Good comments. Mayor Milch.
As to your comment about charging, I think we've all been watching too many movies on a small screen at home with our streaming devices. We need to return to drive-in movie theaters with built-in charging stations next to the place where you attach the speaker to the inside of your car. And so you can watch movies as they're intended to be seen on the big screen and get charged and stay in your car at the same time. That's my solution.
I will be filing for that patent this afternoon, so I appreciate that. So I hope you're already in line, because otherwise that idea belongs to me now. Excellent idea. With that, thank you so much for spending your Wednesday morning here with us today. You know, as I've heard many times throughout my life, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Good morning.